She was just a teenage girl excited for her first-class experience. But what happened next left the entire plane in shock. The flight crew stopped her, doubted her, and embarrassed her in front of everyone just because of how she looked, but they had no idea who her father was. And when he arrived, everything changed. Stay with us till the end to witness the jaw-dropping moment that turned the entire situation upside down. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city are you watching this from. And if you love real-life stories that inspire and shock you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The airport was buzzing with life, filled with the constant hum of rolling suitcases, the soft murmurs of travelers, and the occasional burst of laughter from excited families. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, blending with the crisp scent of jet fuel that signaled adventure. For most, an airport was a temporary stop, a waiting area before the thrill of soaring through the skies. But for Amara Johnson, this day was more than just another journey. It was a milestone. The 16-year-old walked through the terminal, her heart pounding with excitement. Her father, James Johnson, had surprised her with a first-class ticket for her birthday, a reward for months of hard work and academic achievements. It wasn't just about the luxury. It was about what it represented. For years, Amara had watched wealthy travelers breeze through first-class lines, their seats reserved for an experience she had only dreamed about, but today, she belonged there. Clutching her boarding pass, she made her way to the gate, her fingers tightening around the handle of her small carry-on. As she walked past groups of travelers huddled near their boarding zones, she could feel the curious glances, a teenage girl traveling alone. In first class, the thought barely crossed her mind. She was too busy imagining the spacious reclining seats, the gourmet food, and the quiet luxury she was about to experience. Her phone buzzed. "Dad, enjoy your first-class experience, sweetheart. You've earned it." A proud smile spread across her lips. She quickly typed back a response, before stuffing her phone into her pocket, stepping closer to the gate. The boarding announcement echoed over the speakers, and Amara watched as passengers began lining up. As her group was called, she straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and confidently walked forward. The moment she stepped into the first-class cabin, her heart swelled with excitement. The plush leather seats, the soft glow of ambient lighting, the welcoming scent of freshly prepared meals, this was everything she had imagined. Holding up her ticket, she searched for seat array, her fingers grazing the armrests of luxurious seats she had only seen in travel magazines. But just as she reached her row, a sharp voice stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me, miss. First-class passengers only." Amara blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She turned toward the flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s, with a neatly pinned-up bun and a name tag that read Stephanie. For a moment, Amara assumed it was a mistake. Maybe she looked young, maybe Stephanie thought she was lost. Still smiling, she held up her ticket. "Oh, this is my seat," she said politely, pointing to 2A. Stephanie's eyes barely flickered to the ticket before crossing her arms. "Miss, first-class seats are reserved for premium passengers. If you don't have the correct boarding pass, I'll need you to return to your assigned section." The words hit Amara like a slap. She hesitated, looking at the printed text on her boarding pass again. "2A, first class." It was right there. She wasn't wrong. "This is my assigned section," she said, her voice quieter now. "My dad bought this seat for me." The attendant arched an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "Your dad bought it?" she repeated, her voice dripping with doubt. Amara felt her cheeks heat up. She could already feel the stares from other passengers, curious, judgmental, indifferent. She swallowed, shifting on her feet. "Yes, my father got this ticket for me," she said, her voice firm despite the lump forming in her throat. Stephanie sighed, shaking her head. Right. Why don't we double-check with the gate agent? The cabin was dead silent. Nearby, a man in a tailored suit lowered his newspaper, watching with quiet interest. Across the aisle, a woman with a laptop on her tray table raised an eyebrow. A young couple whispered between themselves. The weight of their gazes pressed down on Amara like an unbearable force. She could feel it. The doubt, the judgment. As if every single person on that plane had already decided she didn't belong there. Amara's hands tightened around her ticket. But it's right here. She tried again, though her voice was weaker now. Why wasn't she being believed? Stephanie pursed her lips before sighing, as if dealing with a stubborn child. Fine, sit for now, but I'll be verifying this shortly. If there's a mistake, you'll have to move. Amara nodded stiffly and slipped into the seat, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel her hands shaking as she placed her bag beside her, lowering her gaze to avoid the staring eyes around her. The luxurious first-class seat she had been so excited about suddenly felt uncomfortable. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She was supposed to be excited, proud, comfortable. Instead, she felt like an imposter sitting in someone else's chair, waiting to be exposed as a fraud. Her throat was tight. The humiliation crawled under her skin, burning. For a moment, she considered calling her father. Her phone was in her lap, her thumb hovering over his number. He could fix this. He could tell them. But then she hesitated. No. Her father had always told her to stand tall, to handle situations with grace, to never let anyone make her feel like she didn't belong. You belong wherever you choose to be. His words echoed in her mind. She took a slow, steady breath, lifting her chin ever so slightly. The murmurs around her continued. She could still feel the eyes on her, but she wouldn't let them break her. If the flight attendant wanted to question her place, then she would let her father's actions speak louder than her own words. But as the moments dragged on, Amara wondered if she had made the right choice. What if they forced her to leave? Would she have to walk back through the entire plane, passing rows of passengers who had just watched her be humiliated? Would she have to sit in economy, ashamed, as first-class passengers whispered about the girl who thought she belonged in their world? The longer she sat there, the more the tension in the cabin thickened. Then, suddenly Stephanie reappeared. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her was the gate agent, clutching a stack of papers, his face tight with unease. Stephanie's lips were pressed thin, her eyes sharp, like she had already decided the outcome of this confrontation. Amara braced herself, her fingers tightening around the edges of her seat. And just as Stephanie opened her mouth to speak, the cabin door swung open. A powerful presence filled the space. A man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped onto the plane, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin like a hawk. His expression was unreadable, but his movements were precise, confident, demanding attention. It took only seconds for his gaze to land on Amara. Her breath hitched. Her father had arrived, and in the next few moments, everything would change. This builds strong emotion, tension, and engagement, making viewers feel the humiliation, the judgment, and the pressure Amara faces right before her father arrives. The tension inside the first-class cabin was palpable. Amara sat stiffly in her seat, her fingers curled into the plush armrests, her heart pounding like a war drum inside her chest. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited for her fate to be decided. The flight attendant, Stephanie, had made it clear she didn't believe that a girl like Amara could belong in first class. The gate agent stood beside her now, holding a stack of boarding passes, flipping through them with furrowed brows. Their presence alone was enough to make the whispers around her grow louder. Passengers were openly watching. A man across the aisle leaned back in his seat, lips pressed into a thin line, as if already deciding she was in the wrong. A woman near the front subtly shook her head, as if disappointed by the scene unfolding. Others just stared, their gazes heavy with judgment. Amara could feel it all: the doubt, the skepticism, the humiliation. Her pulse quickened as she imagined what would happen next. What if they forced her to leave? Would she have to do the walk of shame down the narrow aisle, her head bowed, her dignity stripped away? Would she have to endure the pitying glances of passengers in economy class as she was sent back, an unwanted intruder in a space meant for others? Her stomach twisted at the thought. Then the cabin door swung open, a presence filled the space, an energy that shifted the entire atmosphere. James Johnson stepped onto the plane. Tall, commanding, dressed in a tailored suit that exuded power and sophistication. For a moment, he simply stood there, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin. Passengers turned in their seats, their conversations cut short. Some straightened their posture, others exchanged uneasy glances. The flight crew near the entrance stilled, sensing the authority radiating from him. But James wasn't looking at them. His gaze was locked on one person, Amara. The moment their eyes met, something inside her settled, the tight grip of anxiety loosened, the burning humiliation faded just a little. Her father had arrived, and everything was about to change. James walked with purpose, his strides measured yet unwavering. He barely spared the other passengers a glance as he moved through the cabin, his attention solely focused on his daughter. Stephanie, the flight attendant who had doubted Amara, visibly stiffened as James approached. The gate agent clutched the papers in his hands a little tighter. James stopped beside Amara's seat, resting a firm yet reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning to face Stephanie and the gate agent. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire room. A seating issue, James repeated, his tone deliberate. With my daughter. Stephanie blinked, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find the right words. The confident demeanor she had worn earlier, the skepticism, the dismissal, it all began to crack. The passengers, who had been so quick to judge moments ago, now seemed uncertain, shifting in their seats. Some averted their eyes, as if realizing they had been part of something they shouldn't have. James turned his gaze to the gate agent, his expression unreadable. You reviewed her ticket, didn't you? He asked. The gate agent swallowed, glancing down at the boarding pass in his hands. Yes, sir, we did. James didn't move, didn't blink, and the weight of silence pressed against the cabin. The gate agent hesitated, then sighed. Her ticket is valid. She is supposed to be in this seat. A beat of silence, then a shift. Amara exhaled the breath. She didn't realize she had been holding. Stephanie's face paled. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, perhaps an excuse, a justification, but nothing came out. James tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze never leaving her. So tell me then, he said, his voice still controlled, but now carrying a quiet intensity. Why exactly was my daughter being questioned about a seat that already belongs to her? Stephanie looked like she had been cornered. Sir, she faltered, then quickly tried to recover. It was a misunderstanding. James held up a hand, cutting her off effortlessly. No, he said simply, it wasn't. Stephanie's breath hitched. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough so that only she and the gate agent could hear. You saw a young girl alone in first class and assumed she didn't belong. You didn't ask, you didn't verify, you didn't even consider that she had every right to be here. Stephanie flinched. The gate agent shifted uncomfortably. James straightened, his voice returning to its usual steady command. That assumption, it's unacceptable. And I expect an apology to my daughter. Stephanie opened her mouth, but no words came out. James waited, the silence stretched, then finally, I'm sorry. The words were barely audible, but Amara heard them. She saw the way Stephanie's face burned with embarrassment, how she suddenly seemed so much smaller than she had been before. It should have felt like a victory, but instead, Amara just felt tired of these moments, tired of always having to prove herself. James placed his hand on her shoulder again, giving it a small, reassuring squeeze. Then, turning back to the rest of the cabin, he addressed the entire room. His voice was firm, but it held no malice, only truth. Let this be a lesson. The passengers held their breath. The next time you see anyone, before you judge, before you assume you know their story, take a moment. Consider that they might belong in places you never expected. The words hung in the air, sinking into the passengers, like stones dropping into water. A man in a business suit cleared his throat, then spoke hesitantly. "Mr. Johnson, I just want to say I'm sorry. We all should have spoken up earlier." A woman in the row ahead of Amara nodded, her voice genuine. "She's lucky to have a father like you." And for what it's worth, she handled herself beautifully. Amara felt her father's gaze on her. She turned to him, expecting to see pride, but instead, she saw something deeper. Understanding, empathy, love. She swallowed the lump in her throat and turned back to the window, watching the clouds drift past. The tension in her chest began to ease. James settled into the seat beside her, finally relaxing. And as the plane soared into the sky, Amara thought about everything that had happened. She had been judged, she had been humiliated. But she had also stood her ground, and in the end, she had proven she belonged. She turned to her father and whispered, "Thank you." James smiled softly, his eyes filled with warmth. "You stood up for yourself first, Amara. That's what I'm most proud of." And as the world drifted past outside the window, Amara finally believed it. She belonged, and nothing could take that away from her. This expansion deepens the emotional intensity, power dynamics, and ultimate vindication of the moment James arrives. It makes viewers feel the injustice, the humiliation, and the powerful resolution. As the plane soared through the sky, the weight of what had just happened still lingered in the air around Amara. She gazed out the window, watching as the thick clouds drifted past, their soft, endless expanse stretching far beyond what her eyes could see just moments ago. She had been on the brink of humiliation, questioned, doubted, and nearly stripped of her place in first class, but now, the atmosphere had shifted. The cabin was quiet, not with the comfortable hum of a normal flight, but with an unease that hadn't existed before. The passengers, who had watched her, whispered about her, and judged her so quickly, now sat stiffly in their seats, processing everything they had just witnessed. Some of them avoided her gaze entirely. Others looked at her differently now, with a quiet recognition that they had made a mistake. But Amara wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about her father. James Johnson sat beside her, his posture finally relaxed, but his mind still sharp. He always carried himself with quiet authority, but now that the confrontation was over, his presence felt softer, less like the protective shield he had wrapped around her just minutes ago, and more like the comforting warmth she had always known. Amara turned to him, her voice quiet, but heavy with emotion. "Dad, why does this always happen?" James exhaled slowly, as if he had been expecting that question. He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with something deeper than frustration, deeper than anger, understanding. "Because some people only see the world through their own narrow lens, sweetheart." He rested a hand on her arm, his voice steady. "And when they see someone who doesn't fit into the space they think you should be in, they assume you don't belong." Amara swallowed hard, her throat tight with the emotions she had been holding in. "It's just so unfair." She didn't mean to sound like a child, but right now, She felt weighed down by something bigger than herself. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. It is unfair, but life isn't about fairness. It's about how you handle it. Amara let out a slow breath, staring down at her hands in her lap. How she handled it. She had sat there, feeling the judgment, the doubt. She had almost let it break her, but instead, she had held her ground. She had trusted in what she knew to be true, that she belonged here. And now, she had the proof. Her father had always taught her to stand tall, to demand respect, but at that moment, when Stephanie and the other passengers had made her feel small, she had started to doubt if it was even worth it. But James had reminded her, not just with his words, but with his actions, and now she would never forget. James leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough that only she could hear. Every time you rise above it, every time you refuse to let them shake you, you teach the world to be better. Amara blinked at him. You really think so? His lips curled into a small, proud smile. I know so. Before she could respond, a movement in front of them caught her attention. A flight attendant, not Stephanie, but another member of the crew, approached, their row, her face gentle, apologetic. She carefully set a fresh glass of sparkling water on Amara's tray. Offering a small nod from the crew, she said softly, "With our sincerest apologies." Amara looked at the glass, then at her father. James didn't speak, but his nod told her everything she needed to know. This was more than just a drink. It was an acknowledgement, a silent way of saying, "We see what happened, and we know it wasn't right." Amara lifted the glass slowly, feeling its cool weight against her fingers. She took a sip, letting the crispness of the bubbles settle on her tongue, and then, for the first time since she had stepped onto the plane, she allowed herself to breathe. The murmurs had died down. The weight of judgment had begun to fade. She had faced humiliation, doubt, and unfairness, but she had also witnessed change. People were thinking, learning, re-evaluating, and she had been part of that. James leaned back in his seat, watching her with quiet pride. "Remember, Amara," he said gently, "you belong wherever you choose to be, and no one has the right to make you feel otherwise." Amara nodded, his words settling deep into her heart. For so long, she had worried about proving herself, about making sure the world saw her worth, but today, she had learned something even more important. She didn't have to prove anything, she already belonged. And from this moment forward, she would never let anyone make her forget it. As the plane continued its journey, Amara leaned her head back against the seat, feeling the soft hum of the engines beneath her. She was no longer just a teenage girl flying first class. She was a young woman who knew her place, and that, she realized, was the most powerful thing of all. This expansion wraps up the story with a strong emotional resolution, showing how the experience impacts Amara and helps her grow. It's not just about overcoming a moment of discrimination, it's about learning self-worth, standing tall, and making an impact.